welcome and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody on their own screen. I have the great pleasure and the great honor to start and kick off and start moderating the third event we have in place for what we call the Great AI Debate. It is our absolutely pleasure that we again could arrange the meeting with our two brilliant minds, Dr. Michael Wu and Jonathan Reed, which have shown in the last two episodes that this topic is so fascinating, thrilling, and catching up with a lot of loose ends that we had to go for a third edition of our debate. And trust me, I'm not making too much of a promise, as we had seen in the preparation that we have enough stuff for a fourth set of discussions. I would like to give our two stars and experts, Michael Wu and Jonathan Reed, an opportunity to introduce themselves, because there I would goof. Michael, would you do me the pleasure and start, please? Some words on yourself and what you do, please.
Sure. I'm Michael Wu. I'm the Chief AI Strategist at a company called PROS, PROS. It actually stands for Profit and Revenue Optimization Software. So we help, as the name suggests, we help companies and enterprise optimize their profit and revenue. So.
And you have a history.
Do I have a history?
I assume you were not just born working at PROS.
Yeah.
I'm not big with intro, but I joined the company about now 6 years ago now, and before that I was in a social media company called Lithium. I was doing social media analytics, and because back then, I think AI it wasn't even a thing. I still do machine learning and AI related stuff, but I think back then they were just called big data and machine learning. And prior to that, I was using machine learning to model the human brain. Essentially, that was my PhD thesis: is to using machine learning to model the visual processing of human in the human brain. Yeah. So
cool. Lithium was the point when we met and were introduced by Phil Winters, and later we met on the CeBIT show. We have been one of the prominent keynote speakers on the third day in a row of 5 days. Now, Jonathan.
Well, I want to make this fast because I think the meaty part is the actual discussion. But yeah, co-founder Diginomica, spent the last 10 years studying the realities of transformation efforts, and AI has become a key component of my work, both generative and otherwise. And there's a lot at stake here. Our shows here are enterprise focused for the most part because there's so much going on with enterprise AI. But to me, the impact of AI on culture, on everything, on art and creativity, which is profoundly important to me, is very big. And then in the enterprise, there's just a lot at stake right now for companies to get this right. And so these discussions, these open discussions, I think are invaluable. So glad to be a part of it.
We
glad you are part. We are glad.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We are grateful. And I would like to start with one statement. I recall that you would still prefer and go for that as not only a question of honor, but that it is one of the professional passions you do have. You write by yourself. And that is something which came as one of these challenges, aside of that Microsoft, OpenAI, and a lot of other participants offer for typical office workers, that they can save a lot of time by let the machine do the content. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, we're kind of getting back to what bugs me about AI, and I'll do that. And then I think there's an overall framing too around what we've learned since the last time which I think is important because there's been a lot that's happened both, through enterprise events. You guys will be interested in, perhaps surprised to know that some of my positions have softened or changed based on, some of the things that Dr. Wu has said in the past and things that I've seen. I've changed some positions. But as far as this whole content and creativity thing, one thing that drove me nuts this spring at events was when people talked about this as like they would showcase what you're describing at events and they would call it creativity. And I really reject that most of this is creative. Now, there are some elements of generative AI that are surprisingly creative, but when you talk about things like writing a job description or writing an email, that's not creative work. That's content generation, and it's a really, really important distinction between those two things. I do think that some of the content generation use cases are interesting, but to be honest with you, and I hope we get into this a little bit, I think there's more exciting use cases. The one thing I will say, though, is that for some people, I think one of the things that's really coming on strong nicely, and I have a lot of criticisms of AI, but one of the things I like is how in a multilingual capacity, it's helping people accommodate for their shortcomings. So if you struggle, for example, with writing, these tools can be very valuable. Or if you're trying to communicate with people in another language, for example, and you want instant translation, there's a lot to offer there. So I think those things are cool, but I think we need to step away a little bit from this notion that's creative work, because I think we need to have a more careful discussion about what constitutes true creativity than that. That's all.
I was here. Yeah, please, Michael.
Let me kind of offer a different kind of perspective on this, because I would challenge that. I mean, if you kind of, okay, I think certainly there's the AI kind of just responding, right? Kind of just help you automate tasks that normally you would have done, right? And obviously it's just automation, just plain old automation. I don't think there's much creativity in there, but that's often how you kind of, I would say, configure, depending on how you configure your language model to do those tasks, right? I mean, if you for most of those tasks, in the language model, there is a kind of, you could think of it as a hyperparameter. You call it temperature parameter. You can actually set those to, I would say, relatively low. If it becomes 0, then actually the language model is completely deterministic. Every time you ask them the same question, you actually keep exactly the same answer. And typically, it will never actually set it to 0, basically. And if you increase this temperature parameter, it becomes more and more random. It becomes more and more. And the way this actually works in the language model is that, remember, language model works on kind of predicting the next word based on the probability of the next word given the sequence, right? Given that you have a sequence, which is the prompt, right? And then it will basically sample from the distribution of all the words based on their probability, right? So of course, the most highly probable word will be sampled first, right? But then if you actually look at the probability and they actually decay, and then so when you set the temperature to 0, what that means that you will only take the most probable word. Every time you will only take the most probable word. And if you actually set the temperature higher to be something non-zero, you start to sample further and further out in this distribution and tail. Okay, so I would say that in essence, you can actually tune your language model to be more creative simply by setting the temperature higher. And that's,
yeah, I think you're misunderstanding me a little bit, though, because all I'm saying is that things like creating form letters and creating templates and stuff, that's not a truly creative act. That's just creating content. I'm not saying that these machines can't do certain creative things. In fact, I think, for example, some of the interesting use cases around creativity are less around long form content, where I think they do struggle a bit with truly creative stuff, but more like taglines and brainstorming. Like if you ask, I've seen some really successful exercises around brainstorming on taglines, for example, for companies or for campaigns. And I think they can come up with pretty outside of the box suggestions for that. But I just, one of the reasons I press on this a little bit is that content generation and true creativity are a little bit different. And I do think these machines can be truly creative in a certain sense. But it's also really important to think about like what is liberating about creativity in a context of being a human being, because what's liberating is finding your inner voice, and that is not a process that deserves shortcuts or can have shortcuts. You have to dig deep And I just don't want people to lose track of that, because so much of creating a unique, authentic life is inventing your own life. And you can't do that without having the courage to sit back for a moment and create something unique and special. And machines can actually help you facilitate that process. So I don't want to say that they can't do that, but I just want to see if we can make a few distinctions between what's truly creative and then what's just content generation. And sometimes you just need content. Like, for example, we need an FAQ on a new product. That's content generation, and a machine can help with that. I don't think that's a true creative work of the imagination. That's all. And so I just think let's just not abuse these terms. And I don't think you're abusing it, Michael, but I've seen a lot of abuse of the term creativity on the stage this spring.
And gents, I'm grateful that throwing one stone into the pond and creating little waves, that you have not disappointed me, that we can, with a little enthusiasm and ping pong, can start off the discussion. And forgive me that if you feel provocated, it was just a little teaser. Yeah. So
that was a teaser. That was a good one.
I mean, it's about the slight provocation, isn't it? There's no discussion.
It doesn't take much. That's why I think this is so important. There's a lot at stake.
Absolute.
But I would like to say that I think one of the things that I have really enjoyed about these conversations and what Michael has brought to my attention is that I think there's two very interesting dynamics going on right now, because there's a broader AI context that's taking place where a lot of really problematic things are happening, including things like Google's AI inline search, which debuted and has already had some really troubling examples of so-called search, and really concerning that people are going to search and get inaccurate information and settle for that because it's more convenient. And of course, by the way, destroying the open web in the process, which I have a big stake in because I care about it. And also, well, my business is dependent on it to some extent. So there's some very high stakes for me there. But at the same time, so you have all these things in a broader context, but at the same time, in an enterprise context, what's so interesting is how much progress has been made in a short time to really bring these large language models into more of what you might call a responsible context. And there's been a lot of progress in terms of, for example, controlling prompt input around very tight sets of variables around customer specific data, for example, to make sure that the machine generates accurate responses. There's been a lot of pioneering work done around tying in things like knowledge graphs into prompts to make them more accurate, and tying RAG and knowledge graphs together. There's some really interesting stuff that's happening in the enterprise. And I think that's one of the interesting things when you talk with customers at events, because I've been doing this all spring, and customers are really interested in what they can do here. But in the back of their mind, there's all these kind of scary stories that have come out of all the different things that have gone wrong, and all the high profile large language model, mess ups that have happened, because it's really difficult with these large language models, and you try to put on these guardrails, but as Google Gemini found, you can break those guardrails pretty quickly in a somewhat embarrassing fashion. But enterprise is a totally different context, and I think customers need to realize that what we can do with AI in an enterprise context, when we do bear down on the accuracy of these models. And I've been really impressed, because I've even seen some progress in areas like explainability, which is one thing that Dr. Winova and I have debated in the past, and I've seen some improvements there. And you were someone who thought that there could be some advancements there, and I think there have been. And so I think it's really interesting to see that in the enterprise, I think some really interesting progress has been made.
Yeah, I mean, definitely, I think the explainability will essentially be a no issue. I think that very soon. It's the black box problem is probably going to be a problem of the past.
It depends a little bit on how much they use large language models, because large language models are still something of a black box. But there's you can still there will be progress made too there eventually. But at the moment, all the different sources of input that enterprises are using around that are not black boxes and can be used in a query specific way. And I've seen some good examples of this spring, saying this is why we came up with this answer. And I remember our past conversation. I said, this is actually progress, and it's welcome progress, because so if you're a finance professional using these systems, you need to know you know, how you arrived at this information. So I've been impressed by some of the progress vendors have made. Now, one of the things we have to be a little concerned about is that there's still a lot of issues, and Thomas, you just blogged about this in terms of questions around AI readiness, but customers still have a lot of questions
Around
about
AI what?
AI readiness. Like how can
Readiness.
how can I kind of be ready to really apply these technologies to my project? And I think there's a lot of important open questions there to explore, but I think enterprise vendors have come a long way from last year. The only thing is that we're still waiting on more like general availability stuff and more like customer use cases live in production, but it's starting to happen and we're starting to see those at events, and that's interesting. So
I definitely think that the enterprise world has made a lot of progress. I think part of it is just the mandate from investors. I mean, they're just, their CEO, their board, everyone is actually pushing. Sometimes it's interesting. When we hear things like, "Oh, the people are actually, reluctant to do it." So it's not really us who want to do it. Our CEO is asking us to, and we have to do it. So it's a more of a necessity almost now to, and I think the reason is because people are seeing that. I would say that the first mover advantage or the early mover advantage, right, basically it has this. AI is one of those technologies that have this kind of exponentially kind of compounding effect, right? Because the more you use it, the earlier you use it, the more data you generate, the more data you can make your AI to use to train your AI, and it gets better faster. And so it's one of these things that the slight difference in kind of, I would say, efficiency gain get magnified dramatically over time, right? I mean, the example that I always give is like, let's say I could run like 300 meter in a minute, right? And John runs just a little bit faster than me. He can run 301 meter in a minute, right? And if you run for a minute, John will just be 1 meter ahead of me, right? But if you run for 2 minutes, John will be 2 meters ahead of me. But over time, if you run for a year or 10 years, John will be way, 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 way far out ahead of me, because of, even the difference is so slight, right? I mean, so understanding that basically, people are realizing the threat, it's there. If they don't actually jump on these type of technologies soon and fast. So
touching on an interesting point there, Michael, because if your investors ask you to jump on this bandwagon to do AI stuff, so just in quotes, is this really what your clients want? Do they want AI stuff, or are they rather after outcomes? And if they are after
at the end of the
this
day,
AI stuff, are they
business
ready to use
entities,
it?
right?
Pardon me?
Yeah. I think at the end of the day, they are business entities. So they are out there to make profit, to gain efficiency and improve margin and so on. I think that's ultimately what they want as a business, right? And create value for themselves, for the shareholder, and so on, right? But I think one way to do that very effectively is through this tool. I mean, AI is just a tool. I mean, it happens to be that with the most recent, wave of these generative AI, they're very versatile and very powerful tool, and that can actually give them huge efficiency gain and potential to improve their business operation dramatically. But the unfortunate thing is that they also create a lot of disruption, right? So that's why there's this kind of conflict. But the need is definitely there, and people are jumping on it because they're seeing if they could even just very easily imagine what would happen if they don't. They would. It's not hard to foresee that.
John, how do you see that? Are vendors still selling technology? So are they still selling AI or outcomes?
Well, they're able to get away with a little bit of both in this case. And the reason is the following. Some customers have said to me this spring that they don't really care whether it's AI or robotics process automation or whatever. if it helps them do their jobs better and get a result, then they'll take it. And most customers at the moment are, especially in Ralph in your mid-sized market, are wanting to consume this stuff from vendors that they trust rather than like embark upon their own data science projects. But that will change over time. But the reason that you can't just have that mentality is because most companies, their boards are asking them, what is your AI strategy? What is your Gen AI strategy? And so you have to speak to the technology. And one of the things that I've been pushing business leaders on in my posts is you do have to understand this tech a little bit better. And some of my posts have gotten more technical lately, trying to explain how it is that AI gets to the results it does and why, because you need to be able to go defend that and explain why your architecture is going to deliver on value. There are still a lot of issues with return on investment for generative AI. So I would say you have to be really careful around that because, most of the designs that are effective involve human supervision, and human labor costs money. And then you have to look at things like, well, it created code, but then we had to debug some of that code. So then you have to these ROI calculations are tricky and the costs are still expensive. Though what's interesting is that the costs are improving and, as you get more sophisticated. And some of this is, for example, one of the bigger innovations of the spring was seeing vendors get more comfortable with this technology where they use different types of models for different purposes. So in a lot of cases, you actually don't need a large language model to accomplish some of these things. You can use a smaller model. You can, I've seen models rolled out simply for smaller tasks like invoice recognition, where you don't need a large language model for that. And so that kind of stuff reduces the cost, but the ROI calculations are still complex. And by the way, vendors are still, hammering out pricing on some of this stuff. And so it does make it difficult from a cost perspective to really calculate these things. And we can get into some of the use cases. I think customers do want to get started, and there are some interesting get started use cases that we've seen this spring that are appealing.
Exactly to that topic. Sorry, Michael, if I interrupt there. Our friend Alan Bergson has an interesting topic. So maybe we could frame your response to Jon around this question that Alan just...
So I would like to take that, because I think, one of the things, this actually ties into our discussion nicely, is that, so most of the generative AI tools that we can think of, and if you actually think of all the possible use cases of those generative AI, right, the mechanism where you realize ROI is pretty much always some kind of efficiency improvement or some kind of productivity gain. Okay, so it's usually that. I mean, and certainly it can help you drive profitability, but that's an indirect effect. It comes from the fact that you are freeing up people's time, right, from doing the stuff that they normally take them like 10 hours, 8 hours to do. Now it takes them like 1 hour. So they have extra time. So they can actually use those extra resources, that they gain from productivity gain and efficiency improvement to do activity that are more, I would say, that drive profitability more. Okay? So I think that's the kind of indirect impact. So I think there's basically, if you think of all the possible use cases of Gen AI, right, it's pretty much all the ROI are productivity gain, efficiency improvement. So what I often kind of advise people is like, don't overlook the fact that there are actually a lot of traditional AIs, I tend to call them analytic AI, because these AI require some analysis of some data to come up with, recommendations, prescriptions, and predictions, and so on, right? So there are lots of AI out there that can actually help you drive profitability directly, and some of those are, happen to falls into the category that, what we do, like in pricing and revenue optimization. Airline, in fact, have been using these type of AI for decades. Airline is actually very, very difficult business. They are, people may not realize that, on average, the margin of airlines are actually very, very thin. I venture you to kind of take a guess, like how thin the airlines margins are? Any guess out there?
0.5%.
Yeah, I would have gone
Too
to
low.
2. Yeah, I would
It's
have gone
about
to
like
2.
it's right now it's about like 2 to 3. Okay, so
Mhm.
it's like kind of 3. I think after COVID, has hit very very badly. I think before that it was about like 4% on average.
Mhm.
Low cost carrier are able to improve their margin a little bit because they lower the cost. But so airline had been using revenue management to ensure that they don't go red line because if they are not careful, right, they can very easily go into run their business, operate their business in such a way they get negative margin, they essentially lose money. So this is something that often I think is actually a very good strategy. In fact, because if you actually use these type of dynamic pricing, revenue management type of AI, right, it help you drive profitability. So you already have a gain, right? Then you can actually use those benefit, those like revenue lift, those margin that you gain from using these type of AI to fund your other generative AI process, right? And generative AI, as I said, like the mechanism for RI is efficiency gain, right? And efficiency is again, like I said before, it's a rate, right? It's a kind of a velocity type of measure, efficiency, how much you could do within a certain time with a fixed amount of resource, right? So the impact comes in over a long time, over long term, right? It's like that same thing. Right? If I run 300 meter in a minute, right? John can run 301 meter per minute, right? If you look over the short time frame, right, the difference is not huge, right? But if you look over a long time, then the difference become very very significant. So
I think that's certainly
yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was saying that using these dynamic pricing, revenue management AI to kind of help kickstart and fund your longer term AI project is actually not a bad strategy. I think it's actually a very smart strategy.
No, it's not. I think one of the problems we have though is Wall Street expectations are all about these short term extravagant hits, and Nvidia is setting a possibly high standard because Nvidia is selling shovels for the gold rush, which is an unfair advantage to the other. I recently, my hits and misses review this week, I contrasted Nvidia's surge with retailers who are trying to use AI, but who are struggling with macroeconomic conditions and who, there's no magic bullets for them. And so that's part of the problem, is that actually the ROI on this, I think it has potential, but is more of a slow cooker. And there's a lot of short-term pressures that make that more difficult. One thing, Michael, that I found interesting this spring is I ran into a number of customers that talked about some top line growth aspects, which was very interesting. And I ran into one scenario where there's actually a customer facing bot being used on WhatsApp to discuss personalization features with customers. And we know that personalization is a revenue generating AI based activity. And to Alan's point, personalization is also a classic machine learning scenario as well. And in many cases, these predictive machine learning capabilities and also computer vision and things like that can work very well connected to Gen AI. And so it's important to keep that in mind. Unfortunately, there's also a lot of machine-based algorithmic screening technology being used for every kind of thing, whether it's loan qualifying or candidate applications. And those use cases are fraught with peril and danger and the potential to discriminate and require very, very careful evaluation. And I hope more and more companies are doing things like comparing their AI usage to for example, the EU AI Act risk framework, which categorizes different risk levels so that you can appropriately assess the risk and figure out how do you accommodate for that, which is not to say you can never do any high risk AI activities, but those call for much more careful consideration and planning around what the impact is versus things like adjusting pricing in real time, which is obviously like less exposure unless there's some kind of regulatory thing. But anyway, I mean, there's a lot of really interesting use cases that emerged this spring that I thought, but a lot of them fit the description of productivity gains, but some of them are beyond that. And then there's a couple things that really bothered me this spring at events, and we can get into those too. But one of them was I thought the agent.
Can I respond to that, John?
Yeah.
Because in fact, as you mentioned, right, a lot of these, ROI kind of, I would say, top line driver, right? They're actually not from Gen AI. They're actually not from. They're actually, as you said, right. The core algorithm that's making the recommendation is the analytic AI. It's one of those more traditional AI.
Oh, right. But the
layer-
scenario though that I was looking at was enabled by a large language model interacting directly with the customer in the absence of a sales agent. So I would consider that
Sure.
that's obviously also, like, to your point, it's not just Gen AI, but it's a Gen AI. They opened up a separate sales channel that is not like handled by a human, but is handled by a Gen AI enabled bot, and they could not have done that with a prior non-large language model chat interface. So I thought that was an interesting. It surprised me, to be honest with you, that they had made it to that point where they could do that. But
and this was a live
this was a live in production customer too. This wasn't a demo.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Michael, back to you.
No doubt. I would say that, like, again, I would say that, if you just have Gen AI, you cannot have put that off either.
Yeah.
You need
of course.
other. You just like all these other, like, search or fact-based type of application of Gen AI, right? You cannot do them with Gen AI alone because you hallucinate, crazy. But you couple it with the search engine, you couple it with something. So in this case, you're coupling with a traditional recommender system, right? That's actually doing the heavy lifting. That's coming up with the recommendation, and you are simply using the Gen AI as a user interface to be available 24/7 for them to interact with you. Right? That's all that is. Right? I would say that the algorithm that's actually coming up with the right recommendation is actually, a collaborative filter. That's probably the very similar one to the one they use in Amazon, way before Gen AI was even a thing.
Oh, for sure. But they wouldn't have opened up that channel without Gen AI, and so that's where that actually does have impact. And I think that's encouraging, because when you can show top line growth, that's good. I think the thing that bothered me the most this spring, there are two things. One was that while vendors have made progress on responsible AI, I don't think they've taken it far enough. I talked to one consulting manager, a friend of mine, who told me that only about 1/3 of the customers he deals with really want even thinking about being responsible with responsible AI. And there's been some surveys that support this, by the way. The other 2/3 just want things like headcount reductions and of course that's not Gen AI's fault. That's Gen AI being used to justify things that are maybe not the best idea. But vendors need to, I think, take much more of an educational stance on what the right way to use these tools is, because I think the perception is that, well, we built a responsible tool, so you'll use it responsibly. But if you give someone a hand, if you get
glitch,
Michael,
sorry,
glitch. Are you having?
I feel like my system is slowing down. It's like kind of getting a little choppy. I'm not sure if it's me or
you sound okay. You sound okay.
Are we all okay? Aren't on your side.
Okay, let's continue. I've been hearing bits and pieces of what you said, John.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Well, let me try repeating then. So the responsible AI thing, I think needs to go further. Vendors need to. So if you give someone a hammer and you say, I made this hammer responsibly, that doesn't mean I'm going to use it responsibly. There's all kinds of irresponsible ways to use a hammer. In this case, I think it's more of a jackhammer. and so vendors have a lot more to do around education, around showing what the great use cases are and showing where people get into trouble. And so that's really unfinished. And by the way, one of the reasons vendors don't want to do that is because they don't want to make it seem like they're legally responsible for how companies use their tools. And I understand that, but that's not a good justification for abandoning education. The other thing that really bothered me this spring was agents. And it's not that I don't think agents are ultimately going to be useful, because I think they are. But what I don't like in the AI field is when we use a new sexy thing to kick the can down the road on things we haven't accomplished yet. And I felt like agents were used this spring as like, oh, wait till we have agents, then we'll actually be able to do something cool. And it's like, well, actually, agents are only as good as your underlying workflows and your underlying automation. I could have an agent on my phone right now and say, well, go book me a restaurant tonight or whatever. But unless it has access and permissions to the apps that do that and contact my friends who are going to join me, unless it is empowered to do that, it's useless, even if it can understand what I want. And so, I was a little frustrated by that because I think agents actually can be useful, but only in context. My first response to agents was like, aren't you working on workflow automation already? Like, why don't you already have your workflows automated? Because then AI can just pick those up and go do those. And that's great. I think agents ultimately are going to be a big factor, but it really bothered me, some of the agent hype this spring, especially from Google. That was like, come on, like, show us something real that we can use now. But anyway.
I wanted to enthusiastically ask you, Michael, as well as John, about two positive examples. As in preparing some of the stuff for today, I jumped into a typical German mid-market magazine and looked for an AI sample, a lighthouse, they stated, in machinery. They utilized for order management support an AI to optimize the order entry into the ERP system, which has been done manually for 3 hours per task, because they have up to 100 items in the orders, and now they can do it in 3 minutes. And the logistics manager and the managing director were absolutely enthusiastic because they could deliver a better customer service by making that progress. What on the road, aside of the ones you mentioned already, perhaps starting with Michael, have you seen on Lighthouse fantastic positive projects which opened your mind and your heart?
Not really open my mind or heart, but I think it's more like impressive progress is getting to low-code and no-code analysis. I think people could start to use natural language to talk to the data that they, and this is something I think that's pretty impressive. They could just ask them, tell me about this data set, and then basically they are analyzing it, and then to show them graphs, show them chart. They say, oh, can you instead of showing me by day, can you do them by month? So you could talk to them in very natural language, even without using technical terms in database such as group by day. You could certainly tell them group by day or group by month, but you could say, hey, I just want to see this in weeks or in month rather than days. So just simple natural language, right? Rather than using any technical jargons, and they're able to kind of just redo the graph and just show you. And it's a very iterative process, but now at least the people could do it. People could actually have get their hands on some data set and be able to analyze it without any any code, essentially. Pretty much, I would say, without any sophistication in even analytics, or without so I think that's I think will open up a lot of interest or demand for data, right? I mean, previously data is always kind of, I'm a business owner, I just hire a data analyst and I shove all the job to him. They just come out every week, give me some reports and stuff like that, and I'll ask some question. He generate a few more reports and to answer the question and so on. It's now they could just, instead of going through this person, another analyst, right? He could just do it himself. He could just be iterative with the machine in front of him, just talk through it, and then and say, what if I add this variable in there? What happened? How does it change kind of my my ability to forecast the future, or something like. So all that you could just ask using natural language, and it's actually quite impressive. Yeah.
So I'll give you one more practical thing, and then I'll give you a couple of heartwarming examples for you, because you want heartwarming stuff. I'm going to give you that. But first I'll give you just more practical, which is like, I think one of the big ones is obviously support assistance, and you can do that either through a digital assistant supporting the employee, which I think can be also a really good one. But then you can also, in some cases, we're seeing direct interaction on first line support between these types of bots and consumers. And to Michael's point, a big part of the appeal is the fact that this is just a more pleasant way to chat. It's a much more effective way to chat. It understands more, like if you use a different word, it understands it better than classic chat where you just pick one or two options. And so people say like, well, how can you do that? What about hallucination and stuff? And like I was saying, like one of the things they've been able to do is say, if you get this architecture right, is to limit the response to the data from a particular sort of knowledge base. And yes, you might have an accuracy problem in that the bot might not always understand exactly what the customer typed. And frankly, sometimes we don't type the right question when we're doing that. But there are some good results showing things like 20-30% reductions in first line support and stuff like that. And in theory, this fits into that theme of getting rid of admin and putting people into higher level relationship oriented customer facing work, and that's all good. Now, as far as heartwarming stuff is concerned, they're a little outside the enterprise context, but we covered one in a recent Diginomica piece. Madeline wrote about equity in AI, and I thought this one was cool. Another example was an 11-year-old girl who wanted to tackle air pollution, a big problem in northern India. She developed an app to help patients determine their risk of lung cancer, and she trained that model. It was based originally for US only patient data, but she expanded it and retrained it with local data. And I think there's a certain democratization effect that can happen sometimes with these tools, which is not to obscure the fact that there's a handful of big tech companies that are playing a dominant role, but there is a democratization effect. And, my mom was telling me, because my mom visited this week and she communicated with someone that she desperately wanted to communicate with who, only spoke Portuguese, and they did it through Gen AI, chat interface, right? And these translation tools are going to get better and better because for the most part, they've been trained only on English so far, but that's going to change. And so, I think those kinds of things are cool because those are the kinds of things that bring the world closer together and make you inspired. There's also a very, very dark narrative with elections coming up and with lawmakers apparently flummoxed by regulation. So it depends on which way you want to take this conversation, but there's definitely some cool stuff, I think, around transforming experiences so that other people can understand them and compensate for areas where we're weak. So you might call that sort of accessibility, making the world more accessible for people.
That is a cool one.
You just briefly touched upon one, so we are back to responsible AI, which is actually two things: building it responsibly and using it responsibly. So part one, vendors have fully under their control whether they choose to or not. The other part, not so much. So besides writing some nasty or prohibitive T's and C's that they may or may not be able to enforce and do education, both of you, probably starting with Michael, what can vendors do to make reasonably sure that there is a responsible use? And what is responsible use, by the way?
Yeah, I think that's not an easy problem to task. Basically that comes up with every technological innovation.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, you think of John, you say a hammer right before. I mean, no one's going to prevent you from taking a hammer to hit people or something like that, right?
Yeah.
I mean, crimes. It's more. I think it has more to do with, I think, the human, the user of these technology than the technology itself, right? I mean, I think you need to, I think the technology could probably, provide some feedback, right? And say like, hey, this is probably unethical or something like that. Maybe you reconsider. But if at the end of the day, human decide to use it for evil, right? Then I don't think there's any good way to do that, to kind of stop them or prevent them from doing that, right? I mean, and that's why we still have laws and these law enforcement and in our society. If everybody can just behave and then I don't think those will be needed anymore, right? But clearly that's not the case. I mean, San Francisco have failed dramatically, trying to experiment with these type of things. You need law enforcement, and that's kind of and throwing them out the window. It's not helpful. It's actually hurting more.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah,
they-
and I think we have a big problem with laws because we don't have. It's going to be very hard to get thoughtful, literate, effective laws on the books, and unfortunately, a lot of these systems are in production in some disturbing ways, especially in relation to law enforcement and immigration in this country, for example. And I can just point to like New York City, which put out a bot that that's been giving inaccurate and in some cases illegal advice to business owners, and yet they haven't taken the bot down. It was exposed last August and it's still up. And so in theory, there should be a law in the books saying like, hey, your bot's giving out illegal advice. You have to take that bot down until you fix that problem. And by the way, that's a fixable problem. That's a technical and architectural problem they could fix. But it is what it is, right? And so I disagree a little bit with Michael. I agree. Ultimately, you can't stop people from using technology how they're going to use it, but I do hold vendors to account to take the limits of their responsibility seriously and push those limits. And education's the big missing piece. I don't see nearly enough education on the proper use of these tools, the proper use cases and stuff like that. And a lot of vendors have these top line things of this is what we're about with our AI, and education's never on that list. And I say, why not? Why aren't you educating your customers around it? And then if your customers go do what they do, I'm not going to take the extreme position that you have to like deny your customers access to your tools, but at least educate them. And then the other thing is that some vendors do and have told me that they've ruled out certain use cases because they believe they're unethical. So that can happen. And finally, one of the best examples I've seen is there are ways of integrating a risk framework into your development framework so that when your developers are coding around AI, they can see the risk level associated with the kinds of projects they're performing and get appropriate supervision internally from people who understand how to weigh those risks. So for example, if you're building something for HR, then a domain expert from HR can get involved and help educate you about, hey, how does this line up with workplace discrimination law and everything else? And so developers aren't on an island developing this code without any context. And so there's a lot that vendors can do to integrate a risk framework into the entire development process. And that goes for security as well, right? Because Michael can probably tell you that there's new security vulnerabilities brought about by these systems as well. And that's also something we need to incorporate. And that's all. These are I think these are solvable things. It's just that they need to be taken seriously. But yeah, to a point, there's a limit to how much you can do, and then there's a part that you can't control, and that's always been true of technology, and that will never change.
Well, does that mean that we need to build some kind of tattletale function into our AI products?
Well, I mean, I think that, I would say that there's, with every technological innovation, right, there's always going to be people who use it for good, and there's always going to be people who use it for bad things. And, there's actually no, I would say, simple way, right? I mean, for people to deal with these type of problems. I think the only way that we could deal with these type of problem is using the same technology, right? The only way for, for example, if you want to detect like AI copyright issue or whatever, right? I mean, humans can never do that. I mean, human can never scale with that. The only way to do it is using built AI solution to detect those plagiarism or copyright violation or things. You have to just because the technology doesn't exist today doesn't make the technology a problem, right? I mean, the AI is our best hope. I would say it's the best hope for solving these type of issues, right? I mean, if you have some kind of I don't know, if you want to prevent people from writing these type of or creating disinformation and things like that, the best way is to create some kind of AI valid verification mechanism that checks every single content that's being created right at the moment when they're being created, right? And you prevent them and kind of say, hey, this doesn't look like where are you getting this? Ask them to provide the facts, ask them to provide all this. So there are I think AI is actually part of the solution. It's hard to I don't like this kind of trend of thought because it always leads to some kind of arms race, right? I mean, we have to make sure that we have the best AI, right? So we are, I mean, there are always going to be bad actors out there, and they have the same access to the same technology, right? So, but I do believe that there are more good actors out there, and we can develop technology to counteract the bad use cases.
Yeah, unfortunately, at the moment, those tools aren't good enough, and they won't be good, and they won't be good enough through the next election cycle, which is really too bad, because one of the things one of the things that generative AI is incredibly good at is disinformation at scale, and unfortunately, studies have shown that lies, travel about 6 times faster than the truth. I do think eventually these AI detection tools can get better, but for example, OpenAI got so discouraged with theirs they abandoned it, and the stats on more recent detection tools are not good enough. It's just too many false positives. And it can actually end up hurting people. But I think it will get better. But I also think there's some other potential avenues of solution. I think, I'm not going to use the word blockchain, but different kinds of methods for authenticating the creation of the content and tying it to creators could be part of the solution as well. I think we can get pretty creative about that. And so I would agree with you that it's a problem that will eventually be solvable. Unfortunately, in the short term, it's not going to be. And so a big part of our job now becomes to figure out how we discern what's real from what's not. Because if you reach the point, which we get very dangerous now, of thinking, well, anything can be faked, then anything that you see on the news, someone could say, well, that's just fake. And that becomes like a pretty scary scenario. And so we have to find a way to overcome that pretty quickly. This doesn't have a lot of enterprise implications just yet, though it does a little bit. I don't know if you all saw that story of this guy that was hoodwinked into wiring $25 million. He was a finance professional, and it was kind of a phishing email that he was a little suspicious about, but then he was brought into a meeting that included his CFO, and every single person in the meeting was artificially generated, but convincing enough to him to wire $25 million. That's a sophisticated use of the technology. And so, we just have to be aware of these things, because one of the biggest problems with the so-called AI debates, and I'm so glad we've avoided this in our debates, is getting too preoccupied with the Terminator type doomsday things, when in fact the real big concerns, I think, are the pressing concerns around the veracity of information and deep fakes and stuff like that, which we need better literacy. And I do agree with Michael, we're going to get tools that are going to help us. The problem is that the tools aren't quite ready yet, and they're nowhere near ready.
Go ahead.
Question to you, Michael, actually. So to your example, so that there are systems that check the output of other systems, which is great, but shouldn't there be in your mind systems that make sure that this output isn't generated?
Well, basically that's the mechanism, right? I think it's a good mechanism is at the time of the generation, right? When you ask it to generate, before, it knows how it does have some fact checking kind of, for example, you could implement a very simple RAG type of mechanism, right? Basically, if you share something and then you based on what you share, you go out and try to search something. If it doesn't find enough kind of validation or things like that, then maybe you should ask them to provide some verification, right? Mask the user more. So hey, this doesn't seem like a legitimate thing for you to say. Maybe why are you saying this? How are you justifying that this is a real so I think there may be something like that that's necessary. You have to be done in such a way that's kind of not very intrusive or doesn't prevent people from actually, because how does news break out anyway? Because they all come from nothing, right? So it's actually not an easy problem, but some kind of mechanism to check in advance before they're actually even being created, before it even goes out, is actually crucial, right? I mean, like I said, there's nothing that you could. I mean, if you don't help them, he could easily just go write the thing himself and send it anyway, right? If you don't help him, it's not gonna. If people have a bad intention in mind, right? He's gonna just act himself. You just made it easier for him, right? With generative AI, it's not really a prevention. So so I think those type of system will get created. It is unfortunate that they're not created fast enough, but they I have no doubt that they will be created. It's just like I would say I kind of equate this back to kind of this explainability issue, right? So people always say like black box.
Yeah.
Like you can't explain about black box, and that's just not true. It's just that the black box it is simply a complexity issue, right? Our brain cannot process 175 billion parameters, and that's just the inability of our brain to process large amount of information, right? We just can't. But we could certainly find out the most 100 most important factors, or the biggest kind of contribution to the AI's output, and show those to you. If 100 is enough, I'll give you 200. If 200 is enough, I'll give you 500. However many you want, right? If you think you can process 1 million, I'll give you 1 million too, right? It's a matter of becomes a practicality. How much? Because if you sort this kind of explanation in terms of their impact, right? They have diminishing return, right? The first 10 will have the biggest impact, and once you kind of get
let
the first.
me yank your chain here, Michael. Sorry if I interrupt.
Sorry.
So let me yank your chain here. You are a scientist.
Mm-hmm.
So you got a PhD. I don't. I'm just a dumb user. Probably the DAU, the dumbest assumable user. DPU, dumbest possible user. So what I want is not the 100 most contributing factor. I want an explanation that I bloody understand. So see, you are a black box for me too, because I can't look into your brains, right? But you have the ability to explain something in layman's terms to me that is highly sophisticated.
So I guess the thing is, how deep of understanding do you need, right? I mean, I think you could, right? Basically, the explanation is, so the black box is called black box because what goes into the box and what comes out of the box, there's not an obvious relationship, right? What goes in is a bunch of variable. What comes out is some kind of decision, some kind of recommendation, and they don't know how.
Well, and add to that it's not consistent output either. You can get different answers at different times, which is one of the reasons why the confusion is created.
Sure. Yeah, but often those are from the fact that it's actually not, I would say, inconsistent. It's actually the inputs are slightly different because you ask it at a different time. The environment have changed between the first time you ask it and the second time you ask it.
Yeah, so, well, we may have to revisit this because we're almost out of time, but I'm going to make the argument that we have a long way to go on explainability because I haven't seen satisfactory examples. I'm not going to say it's technically impossible, but there's a lot of work to do there, in my opinion. I don't know if we have time for any closing comments.
Yes, we do.
Oh, yeah.
Actually, we have a closing question. You do know that we are asking for famous last words, don't you?
Oh, you are? Okay.
Yep. Yeah.
What is your closing question?
So let's make it simple. What is responsible AI?
Yeah, we did kind of skip over that.
Well, I mean, I think I answered some of the specifics of how to put that into practice. I mean, I don't think there's one right definition, but I think it's thinking about all the implications of what you're doing, not just thinking about the commercial agenda behind what you're doing. In a nutshell, where I'm coming from with all of this is, where I think about responsible AI, there's three things that are important to me at the moment. And obviously you can talk about ethics and all that kind of stuff. First, I want to problematize the definition of progress. We've made a lot of technical progress, but I'm not sure we're making cultural progress. I'm not sure we're making political progress. So I think we just have to be careful about that. And we have to realize that if we want to make overall progress, that we all have to work at it. It's not going to land in our lap. And I'm a big fan of precision. So that's why I love these conversations. Dr. Wu, I am grateful that you're willing to engage on this level because you bring something invaluable to this, and having these precise conversations that include your expert views are so valuable to customers who really want to understand how these models work. So I think we really need a lot more precision, and vendors aren't that good at that because they're really trying to market this stuff, and we need to have a different conversation than a marketing conversation. And third, I just want to mention briefly the scientific debate, because most of this is about making the most of the current models and the current technology. But a lot of the folks who were most actively involved in creating the deep learning breakthroughs that led to these technologies have acknowledged the limitations of these current models. They aren't cognitive models. They don't understand. It looks like they understand a lot of times, but on a deep level, they don't. And so there's more breakthroughs coming, and they're not going to happen inside of most commercial vendors, in my opinion. They're going to happen in labs, and you're not even going to realize they're happening. And then one day you're going to see a whole different kind of AI, and it's going to be way more intelligent. Like I think about like my auto translation, which now gives me this amazing summary of these conversations, but then there's gibberish in the middle of it. And any intelligent system would say, I'm not going to write gibberish to John because I understand this, but it doesn't understand it yet. But someday it will. And that's going to be a whole different world, and it will happen, I believe. But keep in mind, that's not the kind of AI that we're talking about right now.
Michael.
Sure. I think there's so many things to talk about when it comes to responsible AI, because I think I think there's just many levels to look at it, right? I mean, so obviously it has to be responsible to the person, right? To the people who's building it, right? So using data in a way that's respects privacy, security, and everything, addresses bias, right? And it's kind of, and then the next level I would say, like, it has to work, right? It has to addresses company and society's problem. So competency and all that, it matters, right? And that's where I would say bias comes in as well. You can't bias one one group of people versus another group, right? So these are kind of one company over another company, right? So these are basically at the group level, right? And then I also look at it kind of in the kind of society, environmental level, right? I mean, you how do you make sure that these AI are not creating more greenhouse gas or consuming more electricity, and yeah, in a way, like, these large language models are very powerful, right? But most of the time, in a conversation, typical conversation, I mean, just for example, right? I mean, I probably will never ask it about, astrophysics and things like that, right? I mean, so I in fact, I actually do, but but most scenario, it has the knowledge of the world, but most of the time, you would never talk to them about those topics anyway, right? So how do you kind of, maybe restrict the model in a way to fit yours only when you needed to talk about it, right? It doesn't mean you cannot talk about it, but you don't need to actually, I would say, run inference through that part of your neural network when you actually are not using it, right? So the environmental aspects of it, and then there's also kind of the humanity, right, aspect, right? There are certainly things that the AI should never do, right? Is to kind of do targeted weapon or whatever, things of that sort, right? So I think there's multiple level to look at this, and I think this is a much bigger conversation that we will need to discuss further.
Absolutely. And that is probably the best place for us to cut off for now. Obviously, there's going to be more discussion of this topic at some later date. It's the unemptiable well of ideas. But that's all we've got for today. Michael, John, thank you both very much for your time, for your insight, for your willingness to put up with us. It's very kind. To the audience, thanks for sticking with us. If you're coming back next week, we'll be diving into the question of whether Gen AI needs to take a gap year. We'll be doing that with Dan Miller of Opus Research. Hopefully you'll be able to join us for that. But until then, this has been your CRM Convo. Be well, take care, and watch out for those pesky AIs.
Thank you. Bye-bye.